Okay, just testing. Sophia, please just check if people are watching us from Facebook now in section 2 and at the web page in YouTube. Thanks. I guess we're all back. Okay, so maybe, Sophia, we can start appearing for our audience. We're having a very interesting conversation in the private chat. Please, I'd like to welcome all of you back. Okay, Rohan. Hey, my friend. Samu Pondo. Okay, we're gonna have a very good conversation at the end. Your point in the private chat is interesting. That I guess Rohan knows better than about that, because the idea of visible and visible comes prior to the partition of the sensible. It seems to me that it's a kind of violent foundation act. That might be too obscure for our viewers. Now, okay, I guess Brienne is there. Mike is appearing. Okay. So the private chat is burning. Is anyone missing? No, we're all here.
Lorenzo.
Okay, Lorenzo. Where is Rocco? Lorenzo did not get in, Sophie. Marginality. Okay, let me call Lorenzo through WhatsApp.
Aí mudou a ordem, né, Fabiano? Porque aí porque o Beto não veio, não?
Sim, agora que o Beto não tá, a gente vai... It's unfortunate that Roberto couldn't make it. He is very involved in a bureaucratic process of filing forms for our government. Isn't that, Marta? The Sucupira process, which is taking time from all the graduate programs in Brazil. And so he had to he had to finish that and couldn't make it. But
today's the last day.
Lorenzo.
Yeah, today's the deadline. We tried to put it a bit further in 1 week, but it was the last day. So unfortunately, but Beto, the next time we're gonna do that with Beto too. Okay, so now we have a different order that we all have, which we moved Rohan, and thank you, Rohan, for accepting that from first section to second section. And now we're going to start by Samu Pondo. Then I guess it's Brienne and Rohan, and then Jessica. I guess is that, yeah? Okay, so please, son, I want to introduce you because we can do research and we can find about each other, and people that are watching us can do that. So let me pass the floor to Samu Pondo, please. Sam, go ahead.
All right, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, good. I changed the title of my talk today a little bit. It's titled Meditations on the Sacrificial Egg. And I'd like to begin with an epigraph from Gilles Deleuze's Difference and Repetition that reads somewhat like an advertisement from Gwyneth Paltrow's Goop Jute eggs. Yeah, so this is what Deleuze says in Difference and Repetition. The world is an egg, but the egg itself is a staged theater, a theater in which the roles dominate the actors, the actors and the spaces dominate the roles, and ideas dominate the spaces. My text mediated meditation on the sacrificial egg is inspired by Chinua Achebe's story by the same title. In Achebe's short story, Julius Obi, a mission-educated young man, has moved to the town of Umuru, where he works as a clerk in the all-powerful European trading company located right next to the local market called Nkwo. And this is named after the market day. As a space of encounter, the ever-crowded market and trading town at the center of the story had undergone great transformation. As Achebe puts it, the colonial rule and the coming of civilization had turned the market into a busy space characterized by the flow of strange people, things, and strange beings. Similarly, the estranged, and I quote, young persons and daughters of Umuru soil, encouraged by the schools and churches, were behaving no better than the strangers. In addition to the sacrificial egg being a story of a community exposed to new ways of being, it is also a narrative of immunity and enclosure. By the end of a story, a smallpox epidemic characterized by a visit of the evil deity Kitipka has put an end to the coming and going between neighbors and neighboring villages. As both god and disease, Kitipka interrupts desire. He has decorated and connected the dead while cutting off villages from each other. Owing to the immunitary order, Julius, the main character of the story, cannot visit Janet, the lady he's going to marry, who is now afflicted by the markings of a god who kills and scars as he moves through Umuru, demanding, and I quote, the sacrifice that inhabitants owed to the gods of the soil. Acting as an aesthetic rather than ethnographic or psychological subject, Julius navigates and negotiates his estrangement and presence in a colonized, modernizing, yet deeply enchanted world. While the literary text may be read for its cultural insights, it primarily points to how life and gnosis in Umuru is changing, thus revealing how ethnological reason often denies an originary syncretism in the cultures it focuses on. The brevity of Achebe's story does not stand in the way of effectively depicting the passage of time and the fatalistic deities and forces of progress that had turned Umuru from a small village into a busy, sprawling, crowded, and dirty river port. By drawing the reader's attention to the entanglement of human and modern human beings, the sacrificial egg paints a vivid picture of a society where syncretic forms of knowledge practices accompany colonial governance, conversion, and the disruption of everyday life. For instance, we witness the physical and psychological emptiness and terror that fills Julius's days as a result of the smallpox outbreak, but also the uncertainty that haunts a character who believes his Christianity and education as freedom from traditional taboos. And now that Janet and her mother get smallpox as a result, Julius thinks that he might have be the cause as he accidentally stepped on an egg offered in sacrifice by someone oppressed by misfortune. The above interarticulation of knowledges and worlds through literature is sometimes stifled by orders of purification that, though permeable, still enact forms of selection that determine how African knowledges, beings, and things flow on a planetary scale. As V.Y. Mudimbe, Johannes Fabian, John Lou Amsel, Michel Foucault, and others remind us, the meanings and relations such as the ones in Achebe's sacrificial egg are often privileged objects of ethnological reason. As a world-making and unmaking practice predicated on the comparison of cultures, ethnology can either elevate African belief and thought systems to the level of their Western homologues, or present them as closed structures that can only speak of African specificities and interiorities. It can also be the producer of what Walter Mignolo calls colonial difference. This boundary marking practice then proceeds to determine what is or is not philosophy, what is or who is properly human, and even who can be considered to be diplomatic or engaged in a diplomatic way. Insofar as philosophy is concerned, colonial difference subjects the knowledge of the other to the double process of, and here I'm quoting Mignolo, assimilation, such that Arabic or African philosophy is seen to be so similar to Western philosophy that it makes no contribution, or it can be contribute to marginalization. That is, it is seen to be so different that its credentials will always be in doubt. According to Mudimbe, focusing on African gnosis reveals the limits of anthropology as a system of knowledge, while illustrating the invention of, quote, traditional African philosophies within those Western discourses that purport to represent them. To decolonize knowledge, therefore, demands that we do more than engage in a purification exercise that seeks to restore our primordial story or return to a time of original Africanness and authenticity, as we often find within the frames of ethnological reason. More specifically, Mudimbe's idea of Africa illustrates how ethnological reason, and I'm quoting him here, always extracts elements from their context, aestheticizes them, and then uses their supposed difference for classifying types of political, economic, and religious ensembles. That is, ethnology as a mode of comparing and contrasting cultures is at once epistemological and ontological. It establishes a relation between the technical development of material arts and mentalities, which is used to produce forms of knowledge that confirm the inferiority of certain peoples or marks them as being capable of only speaking about their particularities, mimicking, or being ventriloquized by external others. With the culture of the other as its primary referent, ethnology is deeply invested in the politics and laws of genre and, by extension, the genres of man. It involves the comparison of cultures and concept of man, not only across space, but also in time, thus establishing a deep relationship between ethnology, history, and psychoanalysis. Evidence of this entanglement between orders of knowledge is found in Michel Foucault's critique of ethnology in The Order of Things, especially the last section in a chapter aptly titled Man and His Doubles, where Foucault speaks of philosophy falling into a deep anthropological sleep. Philosophy's anthropological sleep and its uses of the African other is illustrated in the third chapter of Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari's Anti-Oedipus, where we see its relationship to ethnology and psychoanalysis. For instance, Deleuze and Guattari recombine and reshuffle orders of knowledge such that, and here I'm quoting them, the great book of modern ethnology is not so much Mauss's The Gift as it is Nietzsche's The Genealogy of Morals. In part, this is because the genealogy is an attempt and a success without equal at interpreting primitive economy in terms of debt, in the debt-creditor relationship, end of quote. Now recast as an ethnological text, the genealogy of the moral brings to the fore, and I quote, the problem of inscription, of coding, and of marking, through which man constitutes himself, and the repression that makes it possible to have certain memories, collectivities, and collective memories. Earlier on in the same chapter, Deleuze and Guattari already wrote at length about Marcel Groul's ethnology of the Dogon in the book The Pale Fox, and the engagement with the ethnological text here enables them to use the Dogon foundational myth of the cosmic egg to escape Oedipal familiarism. Through the Dogon's ambiguous sign and relations based on the placenta, which has become the earth, the ungendered, the full body of anti-production, where the organs, partial objects of a sacrifice no more are attached, Deleuze and Guattari also come to question the organization of the body as such. Here, the Dogon myth gets the same epistemological value as the Oedipus myth, and with the passage from ethnology to philosophy, the Dogon egg becomes the basis of their well-known concept, the body without organs. This knowledge relay is well illustrated in their chapter, How Do You Make Yourself a Body Without Organs in 1,000 Plateaus, where they proclaim the body without organs is an egg. And it's interesting how they draw upon the Dogon, but this isn't cited much in readings of Deleuze and Guattari. Beyond myth, ethnology, and philosophy, the worlds and planes of Deleuzian eggs multiply as we move through texts like his method of dramatization and difference and repetition, where Deleuze turns to embryology to illustrate how Just as with the grains of wheat, no two eggs are identical. Not only do we have intensities, do we all have intensities, the egg, if you like, becomes a model for Deleuze. Putting the biological egg side by side with the schizophrenic egg and the cosmic egg, Deleuze and Guattari destabilize the family drama and colonial order of psychoanalysis by turning to another science of the other, another heterology. Within this anti-Oedipal scheme of things, Oedipus is revealed to be more than a mere psychoanalytical construct. It is, as they illustrate, the figurehead of imperialism, colonization pursued by other means. It is the interior colony. It is our intimate colonial education. I would like to conclude with a few more remarks on what is at stake in thinking about this combination or passage of knowledge from one world to another, or from one form of knowledge to another. This is because such passages sometimes take on a sacrificial form, where an idiom, affect, or world central to the formation of an idea or concept is set apart or taken out of circulation, citation, and use by an order of knowledge that comes to supplant or appropriate its signs that stifling thought or the collectivity and connectivity of thoughts. Whereas a short story like Achebe's Sacrificial Egg supplies us with some insight into the working of colonialism, or a glimpse into the culture or life world of the Igbo under colonial rule, the force of this literary text lies in its capacity to effectively rapture and call attention to a life. With attention to the economy of time and the interplay of community, immunity, humanity, and superfluity that the text highlights so well, Achebe's story creates a space for new and strange concepts to emerge by turning Julius into both an ethnographic subject who tells us something about the Igbo and a conceptual persona who provokes thought about modernity, coloniality, immunity, and humanity. Similarly, combining the ethnological or mythological object with the philosophical subject concept, the Dogon egg, or the reading of the philosophical text as a kind of overlooked or forgotten ethnological text, Nietzsche's Genealogy of Morals, provides a different way of reading the intersection of and passage of knowledges between worlds. As Suleiman Bashir Jain illustrates, such a multiplication of idioms and thought can also be arrived at by pluralizing the trajectory of the translatio studiorum, that's the transfer of knowledge and learning. Such a multiplication of trajectories gives us a geography and history of philosophy, as well as a philosophy of history, where, and I'm quoting him here, philosophy has passed through many languages other than Greek, Latin, and German, and followed many routes, which started from Baghdad, Cordoba, and led to Fez and Timbuktu, end of quote. With attention to thoughts from other worlds, one also has to excavate and unscramble the familiar worlds and knowledges so as to illustrate how diverse fields of knowledge and worlds parasite and feed off of each other knowingly and unknowingly. This being the case, philosophy, as a creation of concepts, has to come to terms not only with the great anthropological slumber that Foucault speaks about, but also its own forgetfulness. A forgetfulness which, as Siba Grovoge puts it, works through cryptomnesia. The concept of cryptomnesia here means the belief that a thought is novel, when in fact it is the return of a memory that has been forgotten or repressed. And this ties a lot to Matter's speaking about the Afro-diasporic culture in Brazil, or what Lorenzo was illustrating between Cubism and African art, and the list goes on. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Sam. As always, very profound and philosophical oriented paper. Very good to debate on that later. So now we're going to move to Brienne's contribution. Okay. So Brienne, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Oh, it's okay. It's okay.
All right. So thank you for having me here today. It's a real honor, and my essay is an essay in progress, and particularly the introduction. but I do want to share what I have so far for my introduction, because I'm beginning with a cultural text, and it's actually a 2019 New York Times at War article. It's called "How Afghans Have Adapted to Life After Losing a Limb." It's from the New York Times website, and more recently it appeared again, featured as one of their articles highlighting the upcoming 20th anniversary of September 11th and the 9/11 attacks. And so there's been, within a lot of sort of news media, with dominant media at least, articles that are being featured right now through this sort of memorial, and then current President Joe Biden withdrawing U.S. forces from Afghanistan, and so the article features a series of photographs of prosthetics, and the photographs are taken from a photographer who is embedded, I believe, within the U.S. military, and came across a home space or medical space that was being used to treat men, women, and children who had been injured by, for instance, explosive devices, and the limbs that are sort of placed along the side of the wall that he took pictures of each one. And in the photographs, as you can see, they're sort of curated as a memorial exhibit, and there's nobody particularly, there's no bodies attached to the limbs, to the prosthetic limbs. And the article sort of highlights, by Matthew Akins, the differential ways in which Afghan civilians have had access to and received medical treatment for injuries from explosive devices as compared to US soldiers. And so I'm beginning with how we can situate, I'm beginning with these photographs by Ross McDonnell within a broader historical and political context that's attentive to US imperial war histories in Iraq and Afghanistan, especially in light, or just the times really, I guess, of so much amazing social movements taking place in the United States and globally around issues of police violence, military violence, and I take as one of the concepts in my paper, which I haven't quite woven through yet, but Angela Davis's phrase, intersectionality of struggles, from her book, Freedom is a Constant Struggle, Ferguson, Palestine, and the Foundations of a Movement, which is a collection of essays and speeches that she's given over the years. And one of the things that she really notes in that text is that it is important to make the links between the sort of ways in which, for instance, US military struggles are interrelated within the United States, within the US territories, within the sort of everyday domestic space of everyday life, and also the accountability and intersectionality of struggles globally with social movements as well, for demilitarized movements and anti-racism movements and anti-gender-based violence movements. And so I'm locating, I'm using that as a sort of framework. And cinema, methodologically, films have the capacity to shift one's perception of the violent effects of disciplinary power and soldiering by bringing our attention as many of us are working with and have been, macro political and micro political dimensions of everyday life. As Jill Deleuze puts it, the cinema does not just present images, it surrounds them with a world. So for Deleuze, the cinema constitutes a particular life world of images, such as images of time and sensation and affect. And so along with Mike's text on cinematic geopolitics, cinema has that capacity to sort of, through cinematic montage and sort of splicing between different time zones and different places, it can show us a different way and provoke us to make connections between seemingly disparate worlds, such as the militarization of everyday life for children in the United States and the militarization of everyday life for children in US occupied countries, still like Iraq and Afghanistan, particularly over the last few decades. How are these worlds of children particularly enmeshed within US histories of militarization? And how are children as agents of change and as speaking and acting subjects organizing for their own needs and interests, and how in our current militarized lives? Okay, so that's like a lot, of course. And so, the text that I'm looking at, which is really most of the essay, is Bhavin Gowadi's Turtles Can Fly. And I wanted to thank too, she's not here, but I know she is here. Melissa Casumbal Salazar, Professor Dr. Melissa Casumbal Salazar, who recommended this film to me a long, long time ago, and I'm still thinking and writing about it. Turtles Can Fly is from 2006, I believe. I need to double check that, but it's filmed through the micro-political lens of refugee children in the Kurdish region of Iraq before the US-led 2003 invasion. And it's exemplary for its treatment of the violent effects of US militarism and bodies in a particular time and place. It provides a more political take on the ordinary citizens that dig up landmines in the region. In the film, the viewer is forced to think about what contemporary wars look like from the perspective of Kurdish children living in a refugee camp. The children spend their days digging up US and Soviet landmines to sell for the United Nations and armed weapon dealers at the international market. Many of the children are missing limbs from the militarization of the landscape through landmines. The film does not focus on the relationships between the women in the village and the children. Instead, adult women and women caretakers in the film are decentered, and a green story of motherhood and rape is centered in the film's overarching narrative. And I'll share a little bit more about those details, but just to make sure, how am I doing okay on time? Am I all right?
Yeah, you're right. Go ahead.
Okay. And it just makes me think too, because we were just, talking in the previous session, right, about centering and decentering, and how Haneke's cachet, for instance, decenters, as Mike, you were sharing, particular things like, whatever, if you're looking at like automobility, or just the fact that everything is very orchestrated in terms of the way Haneke chooses to really focus on the gaze. And so in this way, it's interesting how the children, right, are centered, but it's also really a broader way of talking about dynamics that are happening in all aspects of life. But my analysis of Gowadi's film is inspired by the director's approach to the filmmaking process on the one hand, and the ways in which the film treats the violent effects of US militarism on civilian bodies in Iraq at a particular time and place on the other. After spending 3 months with child refugees near the Iraq-Turkish border before the US-led invasion of Iraq, the filmmaker selected the actors from the group of children, and they play themselves in the film. Gowadi's use of the close-up shot and the long take throughout the film forced the viewer to think critically about the relationship between the micropolitics of militarization, media violence, and the multiple forces of trauma that the children experienced before the US-led invasion. I'm gonna skip over some parts. The film takes place in a Kurdish refugee camp on the Turkey-Iraq border. Like many of Gobadi's other films, it follows the everyday lives of the Kurdish people through the eyes of the children. And I did want to just sort of insert here because I think it's important that talking about motherhood too, I feel, this film, was really also filmed for more of an international audience. And so it was, it wasn't allowed to be screened in Iran. And so the ways that, for instance, issues of sexual violence and motherhood are told through the eyes of children might be another way of talking about issues that maybe adults are also struggling with talking about in terms of war and sexual violence. And I was reminded of an article by Patricia McFadden called Interrogating Americana, an African Feminist Critique. And this is an essay that comes from Feminism and War, Confronting US Imperialism, edited by Robin Riley, Chandra Talpe-Mahonte, and Minnie Bruce Pratt. Quite a while ago, it seems now, but just talking about, as she puts it, motherhood can be a slippery slope as well for feminisms to sort of rally around. And as she puts it, quote, "War, even when it seems to be happening far away, lives and thrives under our skins as women. And the tendency to close ranks around those things that are most common to women, as defined by patriarchal ideology, is something that we must be alert to and vigilantly watch with careful attention. The pain of loss, especially of a child who is loved and wanted, can so easily become a dangerous rallying point for insipidly conservative emotions and alliances. In the USA and across the world, women whose children have been lost to war, whether as aggressors in occupied societies or as defenders of a perceived national sovereignty, can be easily mobilized around emotional bonds that belie right-wing interpretations of security, safety, and peace. Therefore, I think that it is crucial for feminists globally to be vigilant to the implications of reviving our movement in intellectual and activist terms on the groundings of motherhood and loss, even as we give due respect to the sorrow that accompanies the loss of our loved ones, especially through the brutality of war." And so I just wanted to share that because I was kind of thinking about that in the back of my mind as I was reading and rewriting this essay. And yeah, it just feels like it's so much. But I do feel like the film, it really is forcing me at least to think more critically about motherhood as compared to a sort of like national symbolic ideology of motherhood, or even a dominant universal form of like a representation of violence against women in war. I think that the film, as I argue, and I won't do it here today, it forces us to think differently about loss. And it's also, I make reference, to, and are looking through and thinking through a lot of other people who have also written on this film. And one of the things that really strikes me, I'll point out a few images, is the ways in which Gobadi juxtaposes the children's gestures to the forces of militarized violence that surround them and the others in the refugee camp. The children are unequipped despite their resemblance to a small army of wounded children. The sense of oncoming dread haunts each scene of the film. So the oncoming US-led invasion, One of the children is said to be clairvoyant, and he predicts dark futures for the children. Two of the boys, Hengove and Satellite. Satellite's one of the main characters in the film. They argue during their first encounters about approaching a Green who comes to the refugee camp after surviving being assaulted and sexually assaulted by Turkish soldiers and fleeing with her brother and also the toddler Risa, who is blind and is her son. But the film focuses a lot on her deep sense of sadness and the sort of weight of herself in the world. She sort of hides the child as her younger brother and comes to the refugee camp, and Satellite, pursues her, and she refuses him over and over again, and in many ways his boy-like childhood crush to her could be in many ways, as we see in the film, through her through the facial shots that it's very triggering, and her ability to speak a language, to have anybody to talk to about what she has just endured. There's no space for her for that, and so throughout most of the film she's very silent, and instead Gobadi gives close-up shots of her and of Lisa, the toddler, of Satellite, who, as a equipped army, are digging up old Soviet and Russian landmines and selling them on the international market, and through that process are themselves losing their own limbs. And one of the ways that when I've shown this film many times and watched it with students, one of the things that they really share with me is how so terrifying it is, just the ways that Gobadi does the long takes on Satellite, for instance, trying to deactivate a landmine, or when Risa the toddler walks unbeknownst to the rest of the children into the landmine field because he can't see it, he's blind. Or the different ways that Risa cries and just cries and cries and cries, and how a Green, right, is constantly just like both in love, but also really wanting to be, the child is such a reminder of what's happened to her and her family. And so after many of the children who began, in the film, the few children in the refugee camp who did have all of their limbs, such as Satellite, who, starts the film by pedaling around on his bicycle, and his bicycle is a real sign of mobility in the refugee camp. By the end of the film, the American soldiers come, passing through the villages, and as Fabiano, as you had put it in one of the comments, by this time, the children, it's like the war is already lost, right? The help that the U.S. soldiers in the film send to the children and to the people in the village, through messages that they're coming to, to rescue them, to provide relief from Saddam's regime, are in the end in disarray, basically. Gobadi provides juxtapositions between the speed of the U.S. soldiers through U.S. airfare technologies that will be used in the U.S.-led invasion, and the ways that the mountainous landscape, which used to be a site of protection for the Kurdish peoples, has now become, a site that is more precarious because of airfare and the ways that the mountains are no longer protective sites. So he's constantly kind of doing these cinematic montages, splicing scenes between different modes of technologies. By the end of the film, for an American viewer such as myself, one comes to see an entirely different story from the children's perspective. The image of US soldiers running and their capacity to be mobile in a country that is not theirs provides a striking juxtaposition of two different but enmeshed life worlds of ability and disability. And I realize I'm running out of time, and so I will just kind of end with Gobadi's film provides viewers, especially American viewers, a political and effective filmic meditation on the multiple costs of US militarization. The next two parts of the essay, and I might have to cut this out because I think it's too much. Maybe it's less in terms of reading, but certainly speaking out loud, it just feels like too much. But the essay does turn to Omar Dawashi's work on a concept that he describes, or phrase that he uses, called the toxicity of everyday survival, based on his ethnographic research with refugees in Lebanon, and the ways in which different artists and filmmakers, along with Gobadi, attempt to really kind of reframe the atrocities of, for instance, Iraq and Afghan children having inadequate or less high-tech prosthetic technologies, not just to Saddam Hussein's regime, right, but also to the US's role historically, as the film shows, and today, in shaping the conditions of possibility for how certain children, right, certain people are able to live in the world. And that, I really feel like the film and arts, inspire me to really feel and like have an empathetic sense of things, and especially with motherhood and children. These are all things that are so hard to talk about, and I think that's why I love art and I love film and I love literature, because they enable us to talk about things that are hidden, invisible, but silenced, right? And also so deep within different layers of time. And so incredibly normalized, because I was, talking about Fallujah, an Italian journalist who, does this documentary on the US military's use of white phosphorus in Fallujah. And then I walked into the gas station this morning to get a cup of coffee, and it was like Imagine Dragons with their song Radioactive. It's just like the ways that militarization and violence is so deeply ingrained into this sort of like normal, I'm going to get my morning coffee this morning, just really struck me. And I love that film can capture those things and the contradictions of all of it at the same time. And that's it. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Brianna. I was just writing here in our private chat that you have this thing that I call the pictorial writing. I was reading your text and I was seeing your text in front of me. That was the question. It's not exactly reading. I was seeing. I was exploring my senses toward the reading. I could see it, which is very interesting. I guess Rohan has something to say about that too, in terms of literature and his treatment of Rushdie's and maybe Rise movie, The Chess Players. But thanks, Brian. Thanks. I have some questions to you, and then we can talk about that in the final part of our section. And now I'd like to invite Rohan to present his paper. Hey, Rohan. Man, you have 15 minutes and you can go ahead. We're just engaging in this conversation. This is the beginning of the conversation. I intend that to be a conversation that would last for years. So,
I'm gonna take as long as Lorenzo took. Is that fair?
Okay. without lating, please.
I'm just joking. First of all, I want to thank Fabiano and his team for organizing this event. This was a long time in the making. So there's a lot of effort and a lot of organizing work that had to go into putting us all together. And I am happy to see the other participants in this panel, or these two panels, some of whom I've known for a very long time and who have taught me in various ways. And so it's really fortunate to be able to kind of, like Fabiano said, continue these conversations, even though in some ways we know that these conversations will keep going on maybe forever, as long as we're around, and as long as the technology cooperates, I guess. So I changed the title of my paper a little bit as well. I changed the subtitle. So the title is still Becoming Anachronistic. The subtitle is Towards a Post-Colonial Regime of Aesthetics. And this panel, gave me an opportunity to go back and revisit some older work I had done in a project that I had started more than a decade ago about trying to bring post-colonial theory into a conversation with philosophy and theories of aesthetics and politics. So very much in the world of Rancière, which I think a lot of us have evoked so far, and some of the work of Deleuze as well. A lot of that has been sort of curated by Michael Shapiro, who was my professor and many of our professors, or many of our professor. And so it was a kind of, the project is trying to think about post-colonial thought as an aesthetic movement, or as a kind of style of thought that we can think about aesthetically. And then I used two, what are to me very exemplary post-colonial texts, Salman Rushdie's Midnight's Children, the novel, and Satyajit Ray, his film, The Chess Players, as illustrations of what I think of as a post-colonial regime of aesthetics. So it's a very long paper, and I'm sorry that I kind of burdened Fabiano with such a long text. I'm trying to trim it down, and I still have a lot of work to do on that. But what I want to do is read the introduction of the paper, and then kind of talk about those two illustrations, the novel and the film, and maybe kind of gesture towards how I'm comparing those two texts and what they are telling me about this idea of a post-colonial regime of aesthetics. Okay, so the paper starts off like this. Emerging from a history of partitions, displacements, and erasures, post-colonial thought has projected an insurgent, liberatory impulse aimed at a radical decentering of the West, both as a historical geography and an epistemic project. This impulse has entailed a disfiguring, cutting, or repartitioning of the dominant ways in which we talk about things like the West, imperialism, or in more contemporary times, globalization. Such a cutting logic projected against these histories of exploitation and structural inequality carry with it dangerous potentials and pitfalls of spiraling violence expressed in nationalist, ethnocentric, and/or gendered forms. But the act of cutting, of repartitioning, is also a creation. It is a repetition, for it is not the first blow, which potentially creates something different and new. The post-colonial is an impulse to cut back and rewire the entanglements of historical time and differential humanity. Recalling Frantz Fanon's haunting analysis of decolonial violence at the beginning of Wretched of the Earth, this is a form of violence that may be no less an act of liberation, empowerment, and anti-colonial agency than a foreclosure of possibility and the prefiguration of post-colonial violence to come. And both of the texts I'm going to look at today are essentially, to me, about the questions of historical difference and post-colonial violence. If one wanted to argue that there is a distinct style to post-colonial thought, how would one go about defining this specificity? What would be the purpose of such a line of inquiry? How is a thinking of the political both enabled by and limited in a specifically post-colonial regime of aesthetics? Thinking about post-colonial thought stylistically, that is, putting aesthetic criteria to the ways in which the experience of post-coloniality is organized, distributed, and partitioned, puts politics into a critical relationship with art. For art, too, broadly conceived, plays a significant role in the ways in which we organize perceptual experience, how we perceive our life worlds and their mediated possibilities, how cultural expression renders us as intelligible subjects. And in this way, art becomes inescapably political. For as the Indian cultural historian Susie Tharu has argued, and this is a quote, cultural initiatives and cultural practices, whether they are those of dominance or opposition, are by no means restricted to what we conventionally think of as art, literature, painting, film, or music, or the terrains traditionally associated with them, the book, the theater, the art gallery, the concert hall. Their scope is the whole of civil society. Conversely, initiatives associated with conventional art forms are by no means limited to a closed-off aesthetic domain. Their scope, too, is the whole of civil society. In this essay, I want to address 3 different manifestations of post-colonial thought in contemporary times. The ways in which these texts, or this kind of group of texts, attempt to repartition the experience of post-colonial modernity in and through the discourse of the nation as a paradoxical figuration. So partly what I do in this paper is I try to think about this idea of a post-colonial regime of aesthetics, and it moves me inevitably towards a kind of meditation on the problem of the nation and the nation state as a supposedly universal or universizable form of political community. And kind of wrestling with the limits and possibilities of the national form or the national state form as a form of political community, I think brings us to one of the central problematics in a lot of post-colonial texts. So this nation as a paradoxical figuration, what I mean by that is an always already imagined, yet not fully imagined community. That is a political community with 2 contrasting sides, actual and virtual. And here I'm bringing in some language from French philosophy, namely Gilles Deleuze and Henri Bergson. First, I engage with post-colonial theory from and about South Asia, examining insights, incitements, and lines of flight from select thinkers who position a central problematic of the post-colonial condition at the fore of their work. That is the question of historical difference, particularly in the context of modern South Asia. Examining this question of historical difference, particularly in the context, examining the problematic and arguing for its salience in a post-colonial regime of aesthetics, takes me to my next 2 sites of illustration and analysis, where I ultimately argue that the literature of Salman Rushdie and the cinema of Satyajit Ray furthers a distinctly post-colonial stylistic prerogative in their respective ethical treatments of political modernity in South Asia. This ethics is less a codified set of supposedly agreed upon and universal norms or standard operating procedures, and more a contingent and continuously adaptive rubric for a post-liberatory decolonial politics. Rushdie's novel, Midnight's Children, does this, I argue, through its emphatically magical realist treatment of India's transition from colonial to post-colonial modernity, and is accordingly set in contemporary times. Ray's film, The Chess Players, is set in the mid-19th century, so kind of in the middle of sort of the era of British colonial expansion in South Asia, and explores zones of India's tumultuous colonial past in deep focus. Through these contrasting case studies, I arrive at a staging of the post-colonial where art becomes political, not necessarily in terms of its subject matter, representational praxis, or any explicit ideologies which may appear at the level of the story or the plot, but rather in the dissensus that such works provoke, unsettling and disorganizing, cutting, interfering, remixing, and critiquing colonialism's universalizing violence, particularly the spectral forms of the post-colonial national state. So in the first section, and what I'll do now is maybe just kind of speak a little bit extemporaneously. The first section tries to set up maybe a sort of miniature genealogy of post-colonial theory that I trace from the work of Frantz Fanon and try to kind of connect lines of influence to some South Asian post-colonial thinkers like Gayatri Spivak, Partha Chatterjee, Dipesh Chakrabarti, Homi Bhabha, and Ashish Nandi. Now, sometimes these connections are implicit, and sometimes they're more explicit. For instance, Homi Bhabha has a really rich essay on Frantz Fanon called "Interrogating Identity," I believe it's called. Whereas for others, you know, in the work of someone like Ashish Nandi, I think the influence is a little more indirect. But what I find here is an aesthetics of the cut, or an aesthetics of split, where the partitioning of the sensible is founded on a kind of split experience of the modern. And it produces a kind of intense ambivalence that I think is characteristic not only of a lot of post-colonial theory, but a lot of the kind of art, the cultural productions that I talk about later in the paper. And I you know, because of this kind of foundational ambivalence, the figure of the nation state, in particular the kind of idea of the post-colonial nation in India, you know, inherits that intense ambivalence. And you see that worked out in the novel of Salman Rushdie, which is, you know, widely regarded as a kind of national allegory, to use the terminology from Frederick Jameson. You know, where the story at the center of Midnight's Children is really a kind of a metaphor or an allegory for the development of Indian nationalism from colonial to post-colonial times, and the sort of trials and tribulations in the life of the narrator in that novel sort of become emblematic or evocative of, you know, real life historical events in the life of the nation. Now, what Rushdie ends up doing, though, through his magical realist kind of treatment here, is at the same time as he sort of furnishes a view in which you could say there is a national allegory between the life of the narrator and the nation called India, I read the novel as much as about the impossibility of the nation, the failure of the nation to come into its own. And partly that's a result of the context in which that novel is written. It's written in the aftermath of the Indian emergency from 1975 to 1977, where there was a 21-month-long suspension of civil rights, of, you know, democratic voting, you know, mass arrests, curtailment of free expression, you know, and censorship. Where writing in the aftermath of that, Salman Rushdie is sort of as much trying to tell the story, this allegorical story of the nation, as well as sort of highlight the limits and the kind of the internal contradictions of the nation. And here I think he's continuing that line of thought that you can trace back to someone like Fanon as well. When Fanon writes about the pitfalls of revolution, you know, and the kind of limits of nationalism, particularly in a kind of bourgeois democratic revolution, you know, the kind that takes place in India. On the other hand, you know, Satyajit Ray's film, The Chess Players, is different. It takes place in colonial times. You know, it takes place in the year 1856. And what's so interesting about that film, what continues to kind of obsess me about that film, is its historical sort of placement. It takes place 1 year before one of the largest scale events in the 19th century, arguably. I mean, just by the scale of colonialism in South Asia, you might say that what happens in northern India in 1857 was called by the British historiographers the Great Mutiny, what's called by later Indian nationalist historiographers the First War of Indian Independence, this massively violent event which saw upwards of 1 million deaths, both immediate and in the months after, but really a rebellion and uprising against British colonialism that was both kind of led by mutinous soldiers in the East India Company Army, but then also incorporated other groups as well, and eventually sort of propped up a quasi-sovereign regime in Delhi, you know, sort of trying to restore the pre-colonial sovereign status that was in existence before the British sort of disentangled it and took over. Now, what's so interesting about the film is that it takes place 1 year before that very violent event, which had a lot of ramifications for the course that colonialism and arguably post-colonialism or anti-colonialism ends up taking in South Asia. And instead of making a film about that violent event, what Ray instead does is make a film about a king who is overthrown just 1 year prior to that. And so what I'm trying to work out in the film is both the location, historical location of the film, and also how it's aiming its critique at something beyond just thinking of the nation in terms of, its relationship to anti-colonialism. What I think Ray is trying to do is instead engage on an idea of political culture and the way in which what someone like Ashish Nandi would call cultures of politics are both erased and refigured through colonialism. And they provide the seeds for future revolutions. That seems to be the implication of the historical placement of the film. But it also, once again, points to the limits of the nation, that this is perpetually an imagined community in formation that continuously fails to come into its own as much as it continues to be repeated over and over again. And so the fact that the film doesn't address the 1857 rebellion that takes place in northern India, even though it takes place 1 year prior to that event in the same geographical location, chronicling an overthrow of a king that was one of the triggering events of the later revolution. The fact that he's not interested in covering that, what we might call history with a capital H, but instead the sort of non-event that precedes it, I think it tells us a lot about how post-colonial works of art think through the relationship between events and subjectivity. And so I get into that a little bit towards the end of the paper. But what I'll do now with the time I have left is point to a couple of parallels between Midnight's Children and the chess players that I want to, as I'm writing, as I'm working on the conclusion still of this paper, that I'm trying to tie up some loose ends with. So both of these texts take the idea of the nation, which is an actual nation in Midnight's Children, but a virtual nation in the chess players, a nation that's not yet really imagined fully. They take the nation as a site of artistic and implicitly political intervention, meaning that they're less interested in understanding the nation as it is, which is one reason why I think we have to challenge Jameson's theorization of the national allegory. I mean, just for those who might be unfamiliar, Jameson wrote a very influential essay called, where he basically argues that third world literature are inevitably stories of nationalism in formation. And just as famously, for me at least, Ijaz Ahmad, the sort of Marxist critical scholar, critiqued Jameson's notion of national allegory and basically argued that this puts post-colonial literature into a kind of straitjacket, where it's continuously kind of repeating a sort of a history of nationalism that was already elaborated in the West. And so in making this critique, I argue, Ahmad, actually reiterates much of the other critiques of other critiques that you find in post-colonial theory that I outline in the first part of the paper. So this is a nation or an engagement with nationalism where the nation haunts. The nation leaves behind a kind of spectral legacy, and then simultaneously asks the question, what haunts the nation? So for someone like Rushdie, who comes from a Muslim background, which is a minority background, who also writes in English, which is a kind of elite language within India, but at the same time is spoken by a minority. And what I do in the paper is I extend the argument from Deleuze and Guattari that they make on Franz Kafka and Kafka's use of German, what they call the deterritorialization of the German language by Kafka. I kind of extend that argument to what Rushdie does with English, where he pushes language to its extremes. And he takes, we were talking a lot about the politics of visibility and invisibility. One of the things that's really remarkable about the magical realism Rushdie's text is how multisensorial it is. So it's kind of dislodging the centrality of vision and the visual and ocular centrism, and kind of opening up other ways of sensing the nation, or, you know, as we sort of move to the second half of that novel, the impossibility or the disintegration of that nation. So I kind of connect the idea of minor literature, and then in his cinema books, Deleuze sort of adapts that argument in some ways to talk about what we might think of as minor cinema coming from the third world, where the trope that he uses in cinema too is the idea that the people are missing, that these are perpetually political communities that are in formation, or that are in some ways haunted by their incompleteness. And I find that a very apt way of engaging with the chess players. So also in the chess players, you know, if magical realism becomes the sort of screen that Rushdie uses to sort of meditate on the possibilities and limits of the nation as a kind of imagined community, what you see in Satyajit Ray's film, The Chess Players, is a kind of historical realism, not a magical realism, historical realism. Or I'm trying to play around with the idea of a costume realism, where there's such a fidelity. I mean, Ray is someone who is heavily influenced by the neo-realist Italian filmmakers like De Sica, you know, and sort of obsessed with trying to create, to do immense amounts of research in sort of in terms of, you know, approximating the real through cinema. And you see that very much at work in the chess players. However, what's interesting here is that there are moments where the narrative kind of breaks away from the plot and opens what you might think of as non-narrative spaces that are purely aesthetic spaces. And here I think what Ray is doing is he's trying to make a comment on this idea that I call becoming anachronistic, which is kind of, there's a long elaboration in the text, so I'm not going to get into it now. But in other words, there's a kind of technique that Ray is using in order to kind of instill a post-colonial critique into his work. And for me, again, that's a way of engaging with the themes of historical difference and violence. Okay, so maybe I'll try to wrap up a little bit here. That's basically where I'm at. How much time have I taken up so far? Do I still have time to go?
Go ahead. 5 minutes. Is that okay?
Yeah, sure. That's more than enough.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. So there's an interesting relationship that I'm trying to work out on the idea of the event. In Midnight's Children, you have a work of art that's basically centered around the event of India's independence. It's India's independence that coincides precisely with the time of the narrator's birth, right? So that the life of the narrator, the protagonist of the novel, is completely cotemporal with the life of the nation, right? So that's where the national allegory element becomes really, really kind of obvious. But what's so interesting about the film is that there's kind of a twin track trajectory of kind of a becoming of the nation, but also a disintegration of the nation. And it's actually enacted on his own body. His body is crumbling as the story takes place. So you have this sort of dual tracing of the event in Midnight's Children. And like I said in the Chess Players, what you have instead is a non-event, the non-event of the revolution that's not depicted. And what I think this kind of pushes me to think about is the role of historical events in the experience of colonial and post-colonial modernity. So you have certain years, for instance, 1857, 1947, the year of India's independence, the emergency period from 1975 to 1977. And you have works of art that are variously kind of impacted and shaped by these events, but that are trying to unearth different kinds of stories that you can tell about them. So one of the things that's interesting today, I think, particularly in the era of Narendra Modi in India, is a revisitation of the emergency period. And so you're seeing a lot of TV serials, but also historical work, but done by many post-colonial theorists like Gyan Prakash and others, who are revisiting the emergency period and trying to resuscitate kind of alternative narratives from that time period. And I think there's something kind of distinctively interesting about that in a kind of post-colonial regime of art. The idea that there are moments of our past that can be resuscitated in the present, that kind of form a non-linear relationship to time, right? So why don't I end there, and I'm happy to take any questions and continue the conversation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Rohan. It's a terrific paper, a long one, of course, but it's full of ideas. And as I mentioned to you in private conversations, it's very interesting to read all the post-colonial canons that pass through a rereading through Rancière and Deleuze, and then you go to your analysis, which is amazingly done. Okay, we can discuss a bit later. Thank you very much. Now let's move to Jessica. Hi, Jessica. So now it's up to you. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. I don't know where you are. So my colleagues who are sharing this virtual roundtable would like to thank you. Some of them are longtime friends, like Fabiano, Marta, Francini. Some I'm just meeting today. So it's a pleasure to share some thoughts with you all. So many indications of good films, novels, other aesthetics fields, and paths to rethink our ways of addressing cultural encounters, imperialism, colonialism as the violent faces of these encounters, but also creativity and reimagination. So it has been a rich conversation so far. I would also like to express my gratitude to Fabiano, of course, for organizing this, for making this happen. Thank you, Fabiano, and thanks to those who are joining us on YouTube today. I will start with a quote from Fatima Mernissi, the Moroccan sociologist whose work is the basis of my contribution here today. I took it from her 1999 book, Sherazade Goes West, and then it goes like this, quotation marks. Respecting a Westerner is a heroic achievement for a Muslim, a tour de force. Because Western culture is so aggressively present in our daily life that we have the impression we already know it. But in fact, we Muslims know very little about Westerners as human beings, as bundles of contradictory hopes and yearning, unfulfilled dreams. If you could see Westerners as vulnerable, we would feel closer to them. But we confuse Westerners with Superman, with heartless, robot-like NASA architects who invest all their emotions in crafting human, exorbitantly expensive spaceships to discover faraway galaxies while neglecting their own planet. All my Sufi heritage, I was shocked to discover, did not protect me against the most obvious form of barbarism, the lack of respect for the foreigner. So that was the quote. For my contribution to our conversation, I decided to address gender, or the gender question, if you like, considering the persistent silence regarding non-Western voices and their potential contributions to the debate. Even more specific in this matter, there is a silence regarding Islamic feminism and Islamic feminist voices into this conversation. And I would like to share some thoughts with you regarding this silence, or perhaps regarding this refusal to listening and to starting dialogues. Taking the field of international relations, for example, the one in which I was trained my whole life, my whole academic life, of course, for example, we have witnessed at least 4 decades of debates around the importance of gender as both a category of analysis and a starting point for understanding international relations and global politics. We can say for sure that we have a plurality of approaches to gender question and to women's rights agenda in this field, like liberal, post-structuralist, Marxist, post-colonial, you can name it. But there is a remaining difficulty in establishing dialogues among them. Beyond that, I believe it's symptomatic when it comes to establishing a dialogue with non-Western feminist scholars in general and Islamic feminist scholars in particular. All this even after intersectionality, a word some of our colleagues also touched upon, has become a buzzword and a possible solution to the problem. So we already talked about intersectional approaches to class, gender, and race, but I sense we have difficulties in putting this into motion when it comes to include culture. Moreover, as we all know, there is a pervasive tendency in automatically reading everything related to reference such as Islamic, Muslim, and Middle Eastern as the cultural other, the non-West in its essence. We can list a few reasons why there's a resistance by feminist scholars based in the West to engage with Islamic feminism. The fact that perhaps many Islamic feminist scholars are not writing in English, French, or other Western language. The monolithic Orientalist constructions of Islam, Muslims, and the Middle East that prevail in the West. The narrow understanding of Islamism as a religion and not as a historical, cultural, and epistemological heritage and frame of reference, just as Christianity in the West. And relatedly, the exclusionary approach on the part of many feminists towards religious women. All this, even though most Islamist feminists actually adopt either a critical eye towards fundamentalist interpretations of Islam or a secular approach. This is to name a few. On the part of Islamic feminist thinkers and women's rights activists from the Middle East and North African region, many do not describe themselves as feminists because of the perceived Western roots of the term and its association with Westernization and modernization. And as some of Menisi's writings also show, not all feminist interventions take the form of self-identified women's movements. For this reason, I would also like to refer to feminism here with a connotation that encompasses both ideas and their enactments. And some would say we are living in the time of the global now. We are now a few decades past the time the UN has first stated its global agenda to women's rights, for example. Women's movement certainly holds its local idiosyncrasies, some would say, but some would also claim that we are living the time of transnational feminism and transnational, a lot of different types of movements, social movements. We are living the time women's movements reached the global stage, some would say. But at this point, we all know there is a thin line between global and imperial, between universal and colonial. As much progressive and inclusive these movements towards a global agenda for women's human rights and equality may try to be, they are certainly marked by assumptions of universal goals and for a universal woman, as if the experiences of women in all parts of the world and from all backgrounds could be captured as a singular category. And here I'm borrowing the words of many non-Western feminists, and Chandra Mohanty perhaps is one of the most well-known names in this sense. So if we take, for instance, the mainstream historical account about the evolution of the women's rights movement and relatedly of feminist thought and gender studies, I guarantee we will have difficulties in finding non-Western women as protagonists or even part of the story. What we find is the assumption of Western feminists as pioneers with the 19th century suffragist movement in the United States, for example. There's also a focus on events happening in Western societies. The narrative of feminist waves also helps to perpetuate the image of non-Western women, especially from Africa and the Middle East, as inert, backward, and victimized. And I would risk to say that in no context it has been more obvious than in our post-September 11th world. Along with the United States and its allies' invasions and blood wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, and their surroundings, and the security practices directed against Islamic terrorism came the ethical justifications for such endeavors, as we know. Rescuing Muslim women from their oppressing cultures was one important one in this sense. Western representations of Muslim women have a long and troubling history, as many authors have pointed out, including Fatima Menisi, the one I'm engaging with in the paper. However, since the beginning of the US global war on terror, the images of oppressed Muslim women in need of being saved became to populate Western imaginary thanks to the media, political leaders, experts, the cinema, and importantly, human rights and feminist groups based in the West. Thus, a close look to Islamic feminist thought and struggles with an attention to intersectionality, not only in terms of class, race, and gender, but also in terms of how these dimensions cohere with culture to produce specific forms of oppression in different places, times, and bodies within the broader scope of global capitalism, can bring depth to debates on gender equality and women's rights across the world. I'm starting with the work of Moroccan sociologist and feminist activist Fatima Mernissi, but it's just a starting point, the one I'm adopting the paper. Mernissi's attention to cultural encounters between the Orient, the East, and the Occident, the West, and to how these encounters have become constitutive of gender relations in post-colonial societies in the Middle East and North Africa region is one of the reasons why I believe it's worth reading her work as a point of entry to understand Islamic feminism and thus to start filling in this gap. The double critique, a term many post-colonials also like to use, the double critique to Western imperialism and anti-Islamic feeling and to Islamic fundamentalism she proposes is not an important nuance of her work. Besides, Mernissi certainly did not take the experience of her own encounters with the West for granted, as one can notice from the reflexivist engagements within her work. One of her most valuable contributions, I believe, is a strategy she calls returning the gaze, actually something that many other post-colonial intellectuals also do. She watches how the West watches non-Western societies and subjects, including herself, and how this process codifies what and who is Western, and thus modern, civilized, progressive, universal, heroic, and who and what is non-Western, and thus non-modern, traditional, barbarian, backward, both victim and author. Meanwhile, in the process of dealing with Western stereotypes regarding her society and herself as a Muslim female intellectual, as well as with her own stereotyped views when returning the gaze towards her European interlocutors, she constantly puts herself in the position of an exemplar of the cultural complexity of East and West encounters. Playing with stereotypes and an emotionally inflicted language is thus part of her strategy to emphasize the complexity of cultural encounters and of people's perceptions regarding selfhood and otherness. She also experiments different types of writing, like novels, like semi-autobiographical books. So it's also very interesting how she plays with different writing styles to do this work during her life work. As we have limited time to bring our contributions, I would like to name another of Mernissi's works. In my view, one of the most beautiful and one which I just came across recently after waiting months until it was finally delivered to my door from an old bookstore in Paris. So in this sense, thank you, Internet, thank you, globalization, thank you, Amazon. I was able to reach the book. So it's a 1984 book called Doing Daily Battle, and it consists of a sociological study based on the accounts of women across different parts of Morocco. There, Mernissi reproduces her dialogues with these women and tries to write the gender subaltern history of post-colonial Morocco by bringing to center stage the voices of underprivileged women. She talked with factory workers, peasants, immigrants, housewives, sex workers, political activists, mothers, daughters, and sisters, and by listening to their voices and trying to present these real women's experiences, she ends up by bringing a very different narrative from the one portrayed in historical textbooks, in the Moroccan family code, the Madawana, for example, or from the one inhabiting the Orientalist discourse prevailing in the West. By the way, the model one, the Moroccan family code, was only reformed in the beginning of the century after decades of pressure by intellectuals such as Menisi herself and other women's rights activists from Morocco and from North Africa. In this sense, although much has been discussed on how the experiences of non-white women still have been marginalized and silenced, even within feminist scholarship and feminist activism in the West, little has been written on the parallel struggles to achieve gender equality and end violence against women taking place in non-Western societies, and notably women in and from the Middle Eastern and North African region, at least to my knowledge. And at least to my knowledge, little has been said about how Islamic feminist thought can be an important source for a critical engagement with both Western and transnational feminisms. I believe that the works of intellectuals such as Menisi bring a more historically situated and culturally aware view of the gender question in both local and global stages. And in general terms, I think this is one way of approaching our main theme here of investigating how cultural studies and post-colonialism meet global politics. And I think that's it. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, Jessica, for your presentation. I would like now to invite everyone to appear again. I know it's not up to you, it's up to Sophia who is doing that. So I'm okay, we're all ready to go. We have 15 to 20 minutes more of conversation. I was intrigued and thinking about a point that could unite all the presentations. I don't know, when you're discussing, you're trying to order things like this to make things easier. Sometimes you can make big mistakes doing that, but sometimes maybe you can achieve the target. Now, my idea is that I was comparing Rohan's paper with Sam's paper. And I was thinking about the idea of how did Rohan call it? It's the becoming anachronistic, which implicates something that is interesting, that through Ray's movie, you can understand a static regime, a post-colonial static regime that tries to denaturalizes the essentialization of the traditional against modernity. And then I was thinking, and I did connect that with one of the treatments that Mike does in the chapter 1 of Methods and Nation about the construction of the traditional from the modernity or a modern point of view. When you make all things past traditional, you free yourself of history, and so modernity becomes universalized. And that's interesting because when you do this and you move towards this direction, you essentialize the difference and you start practicing otherness and creating stereotypes. And that's what happens in the colonial relationship. And I was wondering about both Rohan's and Sam Opondo's contribution that is a way of denaturalizing that difference in terms of emphasizing hybridity, which is one of the terms that Baba uses. And I guess Rohan mentions that. And it is clear in the point that Sam does when he quotes Mignolo, for instance. I guess this is almost the intent to criticize that. And there's one interesting thing that I like to look at hybridity, thinking about Ashish Nandi and the way he constructs the relation between colonizer and colonized. It's a question of desire. There's something, the colonizer needs to be recognized or acknowledged as someone superior, but wants to transform the colonized in someone equal. and this equality can never be achieved. So the construction of these subjectivities is entrapped in between this impossibility. And so you have hybridism, so you have mockery, so you have all other practices that to me are very interesting. So if you go to a post-colonial reading of art, movies, literature, you can start exploring the ways of denaturalizing that difference, that stereotyping, and moving towards a different reality. I don't know if I made myself clear, but that's interesting. I like to think about that in terms of the tensions that you offered, and the other thing that caught my attention in this section was the idea of intersectionality that both Brianne and Jessica brought in the discussion. And I apologize for that, Brianne. When in my private comment I said, hey, maybe you should keep that for a different paper, because I really like the way you treat the turtles can fly movie. But I think that's important because maybe you can treat intersectionality from this perspective of hybridism. And I don't know how, but I think that there's a hint there that maybe can be explored. But okay, that's all I had to say, just to try to talk a bit each one of your contributions. And now the floor is open. Please, friends, engage with each other, and let's see if we can contribute and continue the dialogue. Lorenzo? You want to say something, Lorenzo? Oh, your mic is turned off.
Yeah, I was thinking about what you said about the canon, and I remember what Calvino said about that. I reread that when I was reading again the work of Lombroso together with Darwin, The Origin of the Species, and The Origin of the Colonial Archive. And then Calvino said, when we look at that kind of book, like it was Lombroso in this part of the world, and beyond that, reconstruction of species, he reminds us that those kind of books, they were so powerful that they impose themselves. It's like if they really, it's my translation, they impose themselves to the general public. They camouflage and they hide in the memory, in the back of our memory, until they becomes the collective unconscious of a community to come. Therefore, we need to do post-colonial archaeological work to understand the mechanism of power that makes those books so important as a canon. And I think that was addressed also in Ron's paper.
Yeah. Sam, do you want to go, or I can go after you?
Okay, I'll speak a little bit, and it's Fabiano. It's interesting that you pointed out the becoming anachronistic. Yeah, because it's what I was going to ask Rohan about. But a certain thread, if you like, also emerges for me. The thing that when I was writing, I was thinking about the dominance of ethnological reason, yeah, as a mode that has literally colonized. And if you look at texts like Johannes Fabian's Time and the Other, yeah, he's not talking about anachronicity, but allochronicity. Yeah, and how people are put in another time, yeah, another time of human development. So that being childhood, the thing that Brian is talking about, but also another time of social development, the primitivism, which you see when Lorenzo is talking about, or even in Martel's text, the people who you share with space, but they're located in another time. So temporalities, literally, or disjunctive temporalities, if you go by what Mike will call it, and how this becomes the basis of how nationalism, for instance, operates. Yeah, the nation building project always has those who are trying to be brought into the time of the nation. Yeah, Italy's Southern Question, which Lombroso pathologizes, the Southern Italians. It becomes a kind of psychologization, criminality, but again, the time of the nation. And for me, this remains as, as a question, which is how certain modes or reasons, humanitarian reason, ethnological reason, reason of state, if you like, play on time, futurity. How does this become, in and of itself, the thing that you're grappling with, such that when you now start even partitioning, that there's a global, there's a post-colonial, and then there's cultural studies in those kind of even disciplinary designation, is sometimes how people are thinking about time, anthropos, humanitas, which genres, which mode of study becomes appropriate, who is studied under sociology and who's studied under anthropology, which artifacts are put in the art museum and whose artifacts are put in the ethnological museum. So the spatialization of humans in time, culture in time, is replayed literally in even how we think we know, how we see, and even how you govern different people differently, if you like.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. When I think of the idea of becoming anachronistic in relationship to the films of Satyajit Ray, and partly I'm drawing on Ashish Nandi's reading of Satyajit Ray and much of kind of post-colonial cultural production that Ashish Nandi analyzes. He oftentimes finds a kind of contradictory pull, that on the one hand, artists like Satyajit Ray have a kind of modernist disposition, a kind of investment in, as Sam was calling, the nation and who belongs to the nation, who belongs to the time of the nation, that sort of modernist movement, the idea that you'll have to let go of tradition, you'll have to rethink your relationship to the old and to the kind of pre-existing, pre-colonial. On the other hand, as I think this film and many of his films do, it opens up a space to think outside of the time of the nation. And I read that as a kind of aesthetic space. And in the Chess Players, it's literally a 3-minute long song and dance item number, where I think the effect of that 3-minute sequence is to inculcate in the viewer, or at least introduce the idea, the possibility of another temporality that moves in a different direction than where we know that history is trying to pull the nation. And again, it's that placement where he tries to resist the narrative, the automatic narrative that all events have to lead towards a kind of progressive national telos, but rather that there might be other forms of aesthetic community, or we might call it community of sense or sense making, another way of experiencing change that these films and certain literature kind of sits right in the middle of, and sort of two temporalities in tension. So that's what I'm really interested in, and what I'm trying to analyze right now.
Let me just say something about what seems to be emerging, and that is every text has a different way of doing historiography. And the temporality that we're all talking about is different ways of thinking the historiographic as a strategy. And it might be one of the ways we can begin to unite some of those different contributions ultimately.
Can I just add like a quick comment about that? So when Rohan talk about like a time or outside the time of the nation, the possibilities that comes with this, or the potentiality of this, I was just thinking about the notion of viscosity, and if we perhaps should consider like the significance of viscosity in the understanding of thinking possibility. I don't have an answer to that. I was just like thinking about this issue, viscosity, in the sense that Aaron Saldanha, when he uses that that concept, he's talking about the how white bodies are favored, kind of benefited by this kind of glue that connects them and allows them to move in a certain kind of coherence. And so I know that in post-colonial literature, we see a lot this idea of the disjunction of temporalities, and of course pluriversality, and perhaps we see the possibilities in trying to escape that kind of path. But so since I started to look at the conceptualization of viscosity and how it benefits white bodies and their movements through time and space, I have been questioning this idea of the pluriverse as an alternative of this fragmentation. I don't know if that makes sense at all.
Who wants to jump in? Mike, Brienne?
I wanted to say something about Brienne's paper because in 2005 I was on the jury of a film festival in which we had to choose the best peace film out of 10, and one was Turtles Can Fly. And I didn't think about it at the time, but now in retrospect, it seems to me that some of the Italian neorealism, like Rossellini's Warscapes, comport nicely with the way Gobadi actually films his turtles.
Brienne, just turn on your mic.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Yeah, it is like an anti-war film. And I remember going to a panel at APSA or something, and it was like, there's no more anti-war films, but there's so many, really, if we're looking at demilitarization movements in films. And so, thank you. I actually, thinking of time, I actually have to pick up my daughter from childcare in 2 minutes. And within late capitalist time, it's literally like $1.50. It's like $1.50 every minute, really. I love you all. You're totally worth 10 minutes, but I do not want the childcare workers, right? They're the ones who have to stay late. So if I'm late, I can't be here ethically. Talking about this as other women are late going home. So I love you and thank you. And I'm going to respect you and honor the women who are taking care of my child right now. Thank you so much. And Jessica, I just wanted to say, like, also, can I just share too, like, I just really want to stay in touch and email back and forth, and the students too. Like, there's so much to talk about, and thank you. So I loved your paper, everybody. And Jessica, I really wanted to talk more to you about your paper particularly, and Marta, and thank you, everybody. Oh my gosh. All right.
Keep in touch.
All right. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye, Brienne. Okay, we can have another round of discussions and then end our colloquium.
I'll just, like, my micro is on. I want to just share something that I'm really marveled how we've been engaging with different textual goods, like films. I'll treat films like text, like films, like literature. And I would like to know about, like, everyone who like anyone who wants to share, how do you feel about trying to, like, dig on this alternative textual products to engage in thinking about global politics, international politics, body and spaces and time, because I'm constantly wondering about this, like how I always feel like I'm pushed towards literature, towards cinema, towards everything that is non-academic to make academic sense of things. So I would like to know, like, how do you feel about it?
Welcome to the club. Mike, please.
Well, I've been pushed in the same direction, and I guess what my career basically has been about is leaving social science behind and turning to literature, film, architecture, music, etc.
I think with a different kind of relation of force, rather than being pushed, I am pulled towards it. Yeah, the aesthetic will be was the starting point for raising some of the things that I think was political. Yeah, reggae music, for instance, was probably a starting point of a certain kind of critical discourse, a certain Pan-African consciousness, a discourse on justice, a questioning of capital. It doesn't come to be, for instance, starting with that you're thinking about Haile Selassie's speech on war that is given to the UN. No, it's Bob Marley's rendition of that speech as a song titled War, that later on you realize these are Haile Selassie's speech. So it's not so much one way, or one proper way. What you question is that marking of a given genre of thinking, a given genre of expression as a proper way, or as the one that holds and has the potential to think. If one takes, for instance, the notion that, let's say, the essay or thesis are what holds thought, and not poetry, and other things, very easily you move from making that claim about a discourse to about people, about who can think, or about what spaces are capable of thought as such, or of providing critical discourse, which bodies in space. So the stakes are not only about what is academic, but also about cohabitation, about relation, and what seems like a contestation of how people make sense of things is at heart a contestation about how people sense things and people inhabit the planet as such.
Can I say something?
Oh, sorry. No, go ahead.
Just a brief comment. I remember to ask myself that question 10 years ago, 15 years ago, and I remember I read that time. The question was why to embark in a strenuous defense of film and photography, and well, I remember reading on photography by Susan Sontag, and Susan Sontag in one sentence said, well, because we understand the world through art, in a very sense. So maybe this is the better way to understand the world. We comprehend the world through art, so that's the point. And it's the better way to engage the world also, the way it is. That's the answer I give to myself. That's why I'm still doing this.
So in relation to think, that just reminded me of something that Mike wrote in Cinematic Geopolitics, that thinking involves resistance to the dominant modes of representing the world. And I think we all find in arts like a way for us to kind of seeing this possibility for thinking, for actually thinking without just repeating the observations from others. And I'm very intrigued by this idea that actually what we see is just like our eyes, it doesn't see anything. Our eyes are not seeing anything because it's just light coming in. So where is the seeing is actually happening? So I'm very intrigued by this question. Experiments like the one they've done in the Himba tribe. And I saw that Lorenzo mentioned Himba in one of the pictures, the photos, where they asked them to identify the blue square amongst the greens, and they could not identify the blue square. And it's clear for us where the blue square is in the circle of green screens, green squares, but they don't have a word for blue. So they have like a lot of different words for green that they were able to find in the circle of different tones of green, shades that we could not perceive. But we could perceive the blue when they could not perceive, because this is not something that exists in their vocabulary. So I wonder how much we are missing because we don't have the concepts or the vocabulary. We have not been taught to identify these things or to include these things in our sensorial experience.
Can I?
Yeah. No, just to quote Mike again. Okay, we're not quoting him all the time. We're very well trained not to see important things. We need to be untrained. That's it.
Can I add something very quickly to Jessica? And Lorenzo, when Lorenzo was presenting, he spoke of Leni Riefenstahl's photography. Yeah, and those become cautionary tales also, because she makes Olympia, yeah, the Nazi film, and
which was amazing, by the way.
Yes, yeah. So it's a question of knowing that even in cinema, yeah, you have the Leni Riefenstahl, you have the D.W. Griffiths and the Birth of a Nation. It's not just the medium, yeah, not just cinema, that cinema becomes contranation. Fascists make cinema, yeah. So it's also to be able to ask what else is coded within that aesthetic form. What does it do to the senses? What does it mobilize? Which affects and other things. Yeah.
Can I? I'm thinking about this question about the border between the academic and the non-academic. I think first you have to think about who is, in fact, the marketing or drawing this border. Of course, people that are inside this small club of academics that you can see academic as magical realism also. So they invest lots of time and energy to draw these borders. So in some way, to problematize this border is something, how do you say, in pro of a cognitive justice. Because another day we were talking, for example, how you have little literature in Brazil about Black masculinities, for example. And there are several people that say, no, you have several musics and you have several samba, how do you say, letters that talk about it. Why this is not a way to make sense of the world and to talk about this? So there are a lot of a richness of knowledge that is lost if you think about in this through these borders created by one side of the border, because you know, especially in Brazil, how difficult it is for the majority of people to access university and to be able to produce academic work. So in some way you cannot think about this without thinking about the power relations that is informing this dichotomy, I think.
Rohan?
Sure. I've just been thinking about Jessica's question, and I think it actually goes both ways. I think it's the case that, in academics, and especially like if we're in social science departments, I think it is useful and imperative to engage not just humanistic texts, but to engage them humanistically, or to put the question of the human to the fore, but also it goes the other way too, which is like, you know, for this project and for another one I'm working on, I've been reading a lot of literature on Satyajit Ray, the filmmaker, and so much of the analysis of his films breaks down into this really simplistic dichotomy where certain of his films are kind of universalistic, they're humanist, they're redemptive. Others are more political and therefore they're not artistic. And that dichotomy between art and politics, it also plays a big role in how the art world and how cultural studies, I guess, kind of perceives their objective critiques. And I think we have to write against that too. That, you know, we have to find where the aesthetic becomes political and where the political becomes aesthetic. I mean, just to kind of put it very simply.
Mike, do you want to say something?
Yes, just briefly. Historians and social scientists tell you what happened and what is correlated with what happened. What literary and humanistic genres deal with is how what happens is experienced by the people to whom it happens and by the people who make it happen.
Oh, precise.
Something just trivial, maybe not so important, but Francine commented before about light made me think of that. Working on photography for a long time, I remember to read about the concept of geography of emulsions, cioè the capacity of the film to absorb light. And I've been encountered this with my current research because I've been talking to technicians, IT, facial recognition, and many of them, they were aware. There is a lot of the news about the fact that those cameras cannot detect black faces very well. There is a rate, there is a lower rate of response, blah, 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 etc., etc. And obviously they blame technology. They see technology as a neutral, and obviously it is not. And if you go back to something very aesthetic, like the capacity of the film, literally the film, to absorb dark subject. Actually, if you go back to the 70s, there was a curious fact with the Polaroid. The fact that Polaroid was actually used in South Africa to detect people that were violating apartheid. In sense, Polaroid was actually commercialized as a actually the joke. It's not joke. Actually, it's a dark humor joke. At that time in the US, it was like a Polaroid, like capture Africans in 60 seconds. There was a push button, very fast push button that was able to take a picture even at night with a low light of black bodies. And if you pay attention to these things about just the refraction of light, which is very technical, you also understand the geopolitics of apartheid. Because, for example, because of the pressure of black workers in the US, Polaroid pulled out of South Africa completely at the end of the 70s, beginning of 80s. So, sorry, just a curiosity, because I encountered this as I was working on the refraction light of the capacity of the lens to work on the camera, because I was tired of people telling me, it's not our fault, it's their fault. You know, it sounds like a joke. They're black, it's not us. You know, it's the lens. It's physics.
Yeah, and to see how that plays out, for instance, with what Lorenzo is studying now, or not so much with the migrants, but surveillance technology. Yeah, in American cities, or facial recognition, because you misrecognize, it doesn't make the black person disappear, but what it does is it now creates mass punishment. Yeah, in that if it misrecognizes, yeah, it means they could get anyone who approximates that particular image. So you do not have to commit an infraction as a Black person. You yourself, by having a certain epidermal schema, are an infraction from the perspective of that mode of recognition. So it's one thing when you think about it, how it's happening in urban spaces with predictive, predpol and other things that are part of the policing apparatus. But you see it with drone warfare again, that someone is a certain height. So it's not talking about pigmentation, it's about taking height. So all these visual regimes are part of a geopolitical register, and to be able to see how these things intersect, not only how they're used or in this sense abused, but the politics of that, how it's when you know how to read the aesthetic in a certain way, you can your attention can be called up, can be called to see other things that are taken as banal, even normal, to see the pathologies of that way of seeing. Yes.
So we have so many things to talk. Maybe we can schedule another one for a couple of months. Are you up to that? Well, thank you very much for being part of this. This is like a dream coming true, be with you guys, with Mike, Sam, Rohan, Marta, Francini, Lorenzo, Jessica, and all good friends. And I really wanted to familiarize a broader audience here in Brazil, specifically people from southern Brazil, but there are people from north, from southeast Brazil watching this live, to this kind of approach. And we have a very huge road in front of us. At least I see when I look at the road, I see a very long road in front of me. So I would like you to join me in this trajectory, and maybe we can make it more popular and attract more people to think aesthetically in terms of politics. Thank you very much. I guess we can finish now our colloquium. I'd like to thank you again, and to thank all of those that are working. And I'm exchanging messages here with all the crew that is behind us. Sophia, that is working, thank you very much. Boris, Laura, Mari, Gustavo, Esther, you're all involved in this, and all other people that participated that. Thank you very much. And we're going to keep exchanging ideas. We're going to keep exchanging emails. And now, I guess, we're going to start receiving the contributions for this special issue, and let's see how it develops. And there's the third part of the Combo project, which is a book in Portuguese. Let's try to do that in the future, okay? Thank you very much, my friends. Take care. Bye-bye.